Thank you. Let's see here. I need to share my screen, and I think this will do it. And I got to look around here. Okay, so glad here to be with all of you tonight, especially with Darnell. Darnell, thanks for being here. Happy to be working with you. And tonight I want to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of financial feasibility, and that's around the pro forma. I'm not really diving. We're going to talk a little bit about the pro forma itself, or at least the kind that I develop. But I'm going to talk a lot about how to get to a pro forma and when and things like that. Let's see here. So I'm a proud member owner of Colluminate Cooperative. Most of you know us, we provide all kinds of services to cooperative businesses, including a host of services to startups, market studies and project development, board trainings, and pro formas. That's what I do. I've been working with co-ops for several years. Principally, but not entirely, not exclusively, on financial literacy and financial feasibility. Now, the disclaimer is that I'm biased. I'm going to focus on what I would do if I were on a steering committee, but my perspective is colored by the work that I do for many of you. What I'm hoping to get through tonight is not the pro forma so much, but to really focus more on timing, purpose, and use. I gotta slide this, there we go. So we're gonna talk about, because these are questions that people ask me. Hey, when should we get a pro forma? How do we go about selecting a consultant? Not a lot of people ask me that question, but I think it's one worth considering. How do you build a pro forma? It seems like your assumptions are really conservative. Do you really need to have all these things in here that you have? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about your vision and what the impact is. I'm going to talk about the kinds of answers that you should be getting out of a pro forma, how you might go about asking what if, and then what comes after you get that first draft of the pro forma. Let's see here. So first question is when? And the first level of response that I give, because people want to know, should I get a market study first or pro forma, what do I do? And the first level I give is that, hey, everyone should be familiar with the 4 and 3 co-op model. So you should be really familiar with this. There's 3 stages, right? Stage 1 is organizing. It's building the organization and getting your support in the community going. Stage 2 then, when you've gotten stage 1 under control, is when you start moving into feasibility and planning. And of course, stage 3 is implementing the vision. So stage 2 is really a feasibility and planning, right? And you all probably know that the model that we promote we find that works for co-ops generally, is that there are 4 areas of feasibility that you want to have green lights on. 4 areas of feasibility that you want to know work before you go all in with the assets of your co-op. The first is organizational readiness, the trade area of the market, the site of the building, finance. And as the slide implies, you can work on all 4 of these at the same time. So if you get a market study first, that's the second one, right? So each of these is a little different, but probably the first 2 you're going to do, just in the sequencing, you're always working on organizational readiness. But then trade area and finance are going to come in. And then the site of the building is probably going to happen a little bit later as you get more specific about where your co-op's going to go. But if you want to start the pro forma first, you're just going to circle back to every time you get better information, new information, you're going to be updating the pro forma. Your consultant should be updating the pro forma for you. So if you get a market study first, then that'll be a basis of the initial pro forma. If you get the pro forma first, then as soon as you have the market study, that will become part of the basis. And then when you get an update to the market study, then you're going to want to update the pro forma as well. But this is all going to be in stage 2. So it's kind of like, it doesn't really matter the order, but most people get the market study before they dive into the pro forma. So I got a lot of different things on the agenda. Some of them I'm going to talk a little bit about, some a lot. I'm going to move a little quickly, but if you have questions, I'm happy with that. If you would drop them in the chat, as Darnell said, she's going to keep an eye on it and she'll give me a heads up.
Heads up.
Okay.
First question already. This is from Shirley from Suncoast, who has pro forma completed and is wondering if the presentation is something that would still be kind of helpful for someone at that kind of stage.
Well, okay, it's a great question. If you have a pro forma right now, you could be thinking, well, why do I care about when to get a pro forma? The last third of these bullet points here, right? We're going to be talking about impact of your vision, which some of you are already deep into because you have pro formas and you're thinking about that. But we're going to talk about the answers that the pro formas should provide and about how you can go about asking what if. And if you're feeling like I got all this down, like, and what are the next steps after you get that pro forma, then you're good to go. But if you want to hang around and just, we're going to be another 50 minutes and you're welcome to stay. Hopefully it will be of use, but I did build this focused on the people who are thinking about pro formas, who are in stage 1 and early stage 2 right now. So let's see. So I want to talk to you for a few minutes about how to go about selecting a consultant. A lot of you, you work with peer groups and they say, we're working with this consultant, and you contact them and that's fine. But there are multiple choices, I think. And so here's some things to keep in mind, that when you get a consultant for whatever, market study, pro forma, anything, that you're hiring their skill and their knowledge, not just some product that they can provide you. So talk to your peers, get referrals, spend some time getting to know potential consultants. You can do that. I almost always have people contact me and I say, let's get on Zoom and learn about each other. You can ask for a resume. Nobody asks for my resume, but you can do a request for qualifications, right? An RFQ is a really cool tool because you're not asking for a proposal. You're asking people to tell you why they are qualified to provide you with the service that you are looking for. You can ask people for references and pay attention to whether the consultant is interested in you and your project, right? In that initial getting to know you, are they asking questions? Is it one way? I tend to forget sometimes to be as curious as I need to be, but I'm always interested in, like, what are you doing? What are you thinking about? Where are you going? Some of the things that you have to then think about is, what are the services? What are all the, because it's not just a pro forma, right? There's hopefully you're getting a suite of services around helping building financial literacy, understanding financial statements, around, like, here we are, the pro forma is working great. No, it's not working. What do we do about that? We have updates to information. So updating the pro forma to go along with those that new information. You're also going to be thinking about the content of the pro forma, right? I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this, but I absolutely believe that you got to have a cash flow statement, that it's not enough. I was looking at somebody sent me a pro forma for a startup and they said, hey, take a look at this. And I told them that maybe you should review it for them. And I just opened it and looked at it and there's no debt. They don't know how much debt it's going to require, what the debt service will look like, and how that all impacts cash flow. And that's all really important in the content of the pro forma. Something that you should be curious about is, what's the basis for the assumptions that you're using? Like, what is your knowledge built on? What's the time frame? Are people providing a pro forma? Right, here's your pro forma. Thank you very much. Service is complete. Or does the services that are being contemplated by the consultant and you, or are they over an extended period of time? And then finally, of course, you're going to be interested in what does it cost? Let's see. Oh, okay. Thanks, Darnell. I looked down at the chat and said somebody has a, but it's not you. It's good. So now I want to talk to you for now. I'm going to switch. These are just going to be little jumps, right? Each one is its own little thing. I want to talk to you a little bit about how the pro forma gets built. So let's see here. So when I'm doing a pro forma, the first thing I do when we start the process is to sit down and talk about what's your vision, because that's each co-op is unique, right? Where it's going to be located, the customers that you want to serve, what your membership looks like, the kinds of products that you're thinking about selling, all these are baked into the vision, the mission of the co-op. So we start with that. And then the next step for me when I'm doing one is to go through like, there's a lot of assumptions here. And some of them, that vision and mission don't really matter so much. Like, for example, what are merchant fees, credit card merchant fees going to look like? They don't really care about your mission. They care about your sales. Okay, that's fine. But what about personnel expense? What about gross margins? So all of these I'm sitting down and looking at, thinking about the vision that we've talked about, how that impacts. Part of your vision will also be in the development, right? It's going to be like, this is how we want the co-op to look or how big we want it to be. These are the kinds of things we want to sell. We want to have a really big prepared foods area, or no, it's not, it's going to be small. All that's going to go into thinking about the assumptions. Where's the cash coming from? You know, some people are like, we're going to get a lot of grants. And then I'm creating the inputs. I'm creating the debt schedule. And then all of that flows into building the financial statements, right? So now if you compared 3 startups pro formas, they're going to look similar, but what's going into them is different. Every one of them is unique. The financial statements are going to be built on 2 periods of time. The first is inception to opening. So it's going to be like, okay, what does it take to get you to opening day? Where's it coming from? How's that going to go? And then that all flows into the balance sheet on opening day. And then there's going to be 10 years of operations. So when I do a pro forma, you're going to get 10 years. And the reason why is a lot of debt is 10 years in length or 7 years in length. And I want to be able to demonstrate that there's a good likelihood that the co-op is going to get through that period of debt service in good shape. So that's why 10 years, bankers have laughed at me for good reason when I show them a 10-year projection, because like, who can actually predict 10 years from now? And the point that I make is that I'm not saying this is what's going to happen. I'm saying, look, there's actually a feasible path. There's a reasonable likelihood that this co-op can actually follow this path and be financially viable, financially sustainable. Finally, I'm going to, I want to highlight the key results, right? Not just some of the basics like profit and loss, but some of the key operating metrics like debt service coverage ratio. So that all goes into building the pro forma itself. Now, in doing that, I think it's really important to not keep pushing the boundaries of possibility. So, or another way to say that is to be relatively conservative. If there are surprises, the co-ops with the unhappy outcomes are the ones who have surprises where either expenses are higher than they expected, the cost of development was higher than they expected, revenues are less than they expected. And so I think it's really important to to know that so many things can go wrong and that you're trying to account for those things, because what you're trying to chart is not that there's a possible path to success, but a likely path. And so I'm moving really quickly. Okay, I'm looking back over.
Do you have a question?
Okay.
From Clipper City. Do you suggest always hiring someone to work your performa? Is it too complicated to do without that cost? Or is it too complicated to do without that cost?
Yeah, and great question, because I almost never answer a question without saying it depends. Like, for example, so if there's someone on the board or a volunteer in a co-op who has experience and knowledge of grocery stores, and also some experience and knowledge of finance, then it's potentially possible that they can build a pro forma that is solid. Again, to go back to the part where I said, when you're actually looking for someone to do this, you're hiring experience and knowledge, right? It's not just a spreadsheet. So yeah, it's possible that you could do it. So the one place where I say you cannot do it in-house, and this was the Durham co-op market. When they approached me about being a project manager, I had a whole list of things. I said, these are all things that you will need. They were like, yes, 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 yes. But the market study we can do in-house. And I said, no, that's the thing you cannot do in-house, because you have to have a third-party disinterested expert when you go out there and ask your owners to invest their hard-earned money in this co-op, your family members, your neighbors. You need to feel really good that you've done everything you can to make sure that that you've been dispassionate. So market studies in particular, but everything else, like project management. If there's somebody on the board or a volunteer who has experience with construction, design, development, you might not need to hire a project manager. But everything that you do, like, you need to make sure that you have a highly qualified individual who can do it, because the risks are significant. If this business is a $4 million a year business, it doesn't take much of a mistake anywhere along the way in the development of it, in assumptions around operating it, that can really make a huge difference in the perceived outcomes and the projected outcomes.
Yeah, one thing that was added as a comment was consultants give, this is from Scott and Kim Bricks of Food Shed, consultants give boards an unbiased, unattached view of the world and provide a good reality check. And I think one thing that you mentioned, Don, was the word dispassionate, right?
Yes.
And so that is, it is kind of an intangible that people don't think about, but it is hard sometimes when in the project.
Yeah, so, and just to give you an example, I was working with a client who, and when I start with a startup, the initial assumption for a vanilla shell cost of building it out is $125 a square foot. Now I have a reason for that, right? Which is the experience of other startup co-ops. I know that construction costs are rising, and they changed it to $65. Right, because when I do a pro forma, it's full of dynamic inputs where what can it come to what if. But they're like, well, we talked to somebody and they told us it would only be $65. Well, that's the kind of thing that lenders want to be really careful. They're really careful about assumptions like that, where somebody in the co-op has changed it to a favorable assumption without a strong basis. And we'll talk a little bit about, like, what does it mean to have a strong basis for changing a assumption?
Do we have a minute for one other question before we move on?
Right.
This is from Kimberly Culberson. What does a co-op do when a market study views trade area as insufficient, but indicates that the co-op should be in a mall with another grocery in it.
Yeah, that's a good, so I'm like, there's an interesting backstory to this. Because a market study that says the trade area is insufficient. Well, okay, so I have my own opinions about, without looking at the market study, it's really hard. It's a very specific question. And so my own take, like they might be, this is almost like they're saying, you know, a mall, I'm sorry, I'm trying to sort this out. A mall environment implies basically a small footprint, right? Anything that's got more than, I don't know, any kind of significant footprint typically needs, you think about going to the grocery store. You know, I tell people you need to have a loading facility, you need to have a parking lot, you need to have visibility, you need to be able to walk in and out easily from the grocery store to your car so that getting groceries out to your car is not a chore. And a mall environment doesn't seem to really speak to that unless perhaps it's an out parcel. There's a now closed mall not far from where I live, but they had a big, for a long time, they had a big grocery store that was out in the parking lot. It's not, and depending on the kind of, like if a store wants to sell organic and natural foods and the competition doesn't really focus on that, then locating near them is not necessarily a bad thing. So being co-located with a grocery store isn't necessarily a bad thing. But the question, Kimberly, that I would be asking my market analyst is, why are you making this recommendation, right? If it's not in the market study itself, then it's perfectly fine to go back and say, we need more explanation. We need to understand what's behind this recommendation. Okay, so now the next thing I want to talk about is why I say cash flow is really important. And I'm just going to talk here on the next 2 or 3 points. I'm just going to talk for a minute. In a business, a lot of the flow of cash is tied to the operations, but not all of it. And the operations that are reflected in the income statement or the profit and loss. And that's the core thing that's going on. There's no question about it. You sell groceries every day. You pay the vendors for those groceries. You pay the people for working there. You pay your staff. You have to pay the utilities and the supplies and those merchant fees I was talking about. And at the end of the day, hopefully you have some cash left over. But there are other things going on as well. So if in this last year, extraordinary year, but still, this last year, co-op went out and got a Paycheck Protection Program loan. They might have a big slug of cash come in, but it's not on their profit and loss, right? That is a change in the balance sheet. So it actually came as a loan, and at some point it'll be forgiven, but it shows up on the balance sheet as a loan. And therefore, and then, so a balance sheet, I can get into so many weeds here, but a balance sheet, on one side you have assets, on the other side you have liabilities and equity. The assets are the things that the co-op has or owns. The other side of it is how they paid for those. So the liabilities is outside sources that help pay for what they have. And the equity stuff is sort of internal sources that help pay for what they have. And so if you get in a Paycheck Protection Program proceeds of $100,000, that increases that liability, at least temporarily. Eventually it'll move to the equity side, still on the same side of the balance sheet. And on the other side, it's going to increase cash, but it won't show up in the income statement. So to be able to recognize, so here's the next thing that happens. If you go out and you borrow $100,000 from a bank and you're paying it off, when you return the principal to the bank, that is not an expense. It doesn't show up in the income statement. There are other things as well. And so those all happen through the balance sheet. So much of the business is in the income statement, but there is a chunk that's going on the balance sheet. And then the cash flow statement ties those two together. It says, what's everything that happened? So if you're doing it on an annual basis, what's everything that happened in the store operationally for a year? That's on the income. And what happened on our balance sheet between the end of this year and the end of last year? Because those changes impacted cash. If your inventory went up $5,000, the only way it went up $5,000 is if you paid for it. So that reduced your cash by $5,000. And so all of that goes into the cash flow statement. And then you get down to the bottom, everything else, and then there's debt service. And then you can see, is cash coming into the co-op or is cash flowing out of the co-op? What's the rate of change? And over 10 years, is it accreting? Is it building? Or is it gone negative? And then with a well-built pro forma, you can go back into it and start tinkering with some of the inputs, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's why I insist that a well-built pro forma has to include cash flow. Let's see, I see.
Ready for the next question? Or
Yes.
Okay. This was from Shirley from Suncoast. Due to lack of getting new owners due to the country situation, what is the amount of money that we should hold on our accounts when looking to hire a consultant?
So I'm not exactly sure I understand the question in great detail, but let me try to answer it this way. The great thing about the 4 and 3 model, which the 3 stages, is that first stage is all about like building support in the community. And that support is best demonstrated by the number of owners that you're able to convince to come and join and give you part of their resources to help build the co-op. And by doing so, you begin to build a chest of funds. You begin to build a pot of money that you can then use for that feasibility stage to pay people for a market study, for pro forma, for early design development work, any of the things that you need regarding feasibility. So if a co-op is struggling to get new owners right now, there are co-ops that are not struggling. So one of the questions would be, okay, what's different? What's happening? How can we get the word out about what we're planning and get people excited, even if we can't be at the farmer's market with a booth? How can we do this? And then you're looking at what are all the things that we need cash for, right? Do we have enough? If we have enough, let's get a market study. Or some market study consultants will do a sort of preliminary market study. It'll cost less and give you some idea to help you get started on feasibility. So you're juggling all of these and the variables that you're juggling at early stage 2 are like a 10th, a 20th of the variables that you'll be juggling by the time you get to early stage 3. So you're looking at, well, how much cash do we have? What do we need to spend money on? What's our plans? What's our budget? How are we budgeted here? Do we have enough? And then how do we proceed? I hope that helped answer the question. I want to talk a little bit now about your vision, because one of the things that happens when you go to do a pro forma is that for the first time, you're beginning to be bounded. So I'm going to talk in the first person here, which is that. So if I start a pro forma for someone, up until that point, their ability to dream, to vision what they want to do, has been almost entirely unbounded. so they can think about, well, how big do we want the store to be? And what do we want it to sell? And how do we want to interact with the community? And all those things, or almost all those things, have a financial impact. So if I'm working with a new client, it wouldn't surprise me. It doesn't always happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if someone said, our vision is that we're going to have a small store. We're going to sell organic foods. We're going to have the lowest prices in the community, and we're going to pay the best wages, right? Because who wouldn't want a vision like that? I mean, there are people who would want a vision like that. And if that's not your vision, don't get me the wrong way. But, you know, it's a nice vision in itself. And part of my job, so the first draft of the pro forma is that I'm trying to say, okay, let me model your vision, whatever it is. Let me model your vision. And then when we sit down and we look at the initial draft of the pro forma, we can see how it looks like that might play out. So here are just some numbers. Like, I'm not asking people to start changing your vision tonight. You shouldn't do that. But how does the vision impact it? So a typical natural and organic co-op that has been in business for a few years, has really well-established systems, and is generally, their trade is generally with, you know, middle class, upper middle class, people who are mission-driven customers. They can often get a gross margin. Gross margin is what you have left after you pay for the products you sell, right? So it's what you pay everything else with. They might be able to get a gross margin as high as 39 cents on a dollar. That would be good, 39 cents on a dollar. An independent conventional grocery store might be getting 30 cents on a dollar. That 9 cents is huge, 9% of sales. So an organic and natural grocery co-op that we were talking about, they might have gotten into the habit of spending as much as 25% of sales on personnel expense. The conventional supermarket, with those low margins, remember that the conventional supermarket, what they're primarily offering is convenience and price. And so they're really price competing like with everybody, the dollar store, the Walmart, you know, the big grocery store down the street, the Aldi's. And so they're really focused on like, how do we got to keep prices low. So in order to do that, they can only spend about 16 cents, 16% of sales. So there's that 9% again, right? 25% to 16%, because you still have to pay the rent, you still have to pay the utilities, you still have to pay supplies. And so depending on the vision about the co-op, you begin to place the co-op into one of these sort of broad buckets. And when somebody wants to do a hybrid, right, we're going to do a hybrid, we're going to mix, then it may fall in between. And there are, you know, real consequences to the margins that you're able to get, and therefore the amount of money you're able to spend on personnel expense. And that's just one example of how vision impacts. So when you're working on a pro forma, that's when you begin to look at what are all the things that are going into the results we're getting, and what are the things we need to really think about in terms of you know, how we're going to develop the store. It might be the size of the store for the market. It might be, I mean, I'm telling people, like, you can think about, like, the Durham Co-op, which I was part of, is really bare bones, right? The refrigeration equipment is great, but the concrete floor is bare concrete. And so, and it doesn't impact sales. It's not as nutty crunchy, but it works really, really well. So all these things go into the vision, all impact the outcomes. So one of the things then that people don't ask me, but it would be a good question, is that like, what should we be getting out of the pro forma? So one of them is, of course, as we said, it's like, hey, what's the vision? You know, we're looking at, you know, what are the impacts? Is it sustainable? And if it's not, why not? What's going on? What do we need to think about, right? Then you do have a question beyond the sustainability of the co-op itself. It's like, okay, is this now do we have a model that we can take to a bank, right? Will banks, you know, take a really close look at this? Institutional lenders, banks aren't the only ones. And if not, why not? What do we need to look at to make this a more lendable project? And then there's a question of and I've been talking about this, right? I was talking about this with vision and impact. What are the issues that the board really needs to consider in order to get this project to feasibility? And some of those may be like, hey, the community campaign, the stretch goals for the community campaign, for example. So these are some of the broad questions that have to be answered. Again, is the vision sustainable? What's behind that? Is it bankable? And what's behind that? And what else do we need to be thinking about? So once you begin to get that, then there's this question of like, when I call it the what if, right? So if you're looking at it and you're saying, well, we're not quite there yet, then you should be able to go back and say, but what if we reduce our personnel expense a little bit? So I was doing this with a client today, and we were going through a pro forma, and we were looking at, well, gross margin, product mix, impact on the gross margins. We were looking at personnel expense. We were looking at a number of different issues, how much money they were going to raise through like preferred shares, how much they were going to bank. They came back and they said, actually, there's an economic development agency. So we think that we might be able to get a 1% loan for half of the bank loan. Okay, we put that into the pro forma. And then they said, wait a minute, we're actually thinking you have 6,000 square feet here for the sales area. We're thinking 4,000 square feet. Okay, we made that change. And when we made the changes, we could watch the outcomes shift with each one of those. What if it's a little smaller? What if we spend a little less on personnel? You know, what if we can get a better loan? And you should be able to do that with your pro forma, and you should be doing that with your pro forma. Not because here's the thing that you shouldn't do. You should not go in and make a bunch of changes yourself and then take it to a lender, or especially to an unsophisticated lender like your neighbors and your family. But you can do that, and then you can go back to your consultant and say, here's all the things that we've been looking at. Well, we want to go over them with you, because if you change the cost of construction to $65 a foot, I'm going to be like, what's the basis, right? And I'll spend a minute. We have a few minutes. I'll tell you, because that's part of next steps. But I'm going to be asking you, why did you change that to $65? And if you say, well, contractor told us we could do it for that, then I'm going to ask you, did they have experience building grocery stores? Because I do. And I can tell you that it would be really easy to overlook a lot of the significant expense that's involved, not with the retail, but with retail grocery. And so I'd be like, so that's why you don't want to make a bunch of changes and then put it in front of a lender, particularly the community, without getting it vetted and making sure that everything is dispassionate, to go back to what I said earlier, neutral, that all of that is being reviewed. But that shouldn't stop you from asking, what if? So then at that point, like what you're left with is, we have the pro forma. We think it's $65 a foot. Don's telling us it's more. What do we do? And the answer is you get better information. And there's so many assumptions that go into this. So how do you get better information about construction? I just told you. I'm going to tell you again, because it's really important. You find a contractor in your community who has built grocery stores. You don't even have to put a plan in front of them to get better information. Because if they have experience building grocery stores and you have a site, even if you don't have a site, they might be able to tell you, hey, you should be figuring 120. What is it? Is it a warm shell, right? Does it already have HVAC on the roof? Okay, then figure $120 a foot. If you can take them to a building and you can say, see that building right there? Because now they're looking at the condition of the building and they're using that in their very rough numbers they're giving you. And you're telling them, hey, this is not a contract. I'm just looking for information right now. So then they can look at the building and they might even ask you, well, what are your finishes, right? Do you have stainless steel on the walls behind the stoves? You have ceramic tile? What are you envisioning, right? And of course, my answer is always, what's the lowest cost? Because that's what's going to get you to feasibility. What's better for equipment? So if you have a site, right? So the first thing you can do with equipment is you got plenty of peers. You're working with peer groups in FCI. Some of them have gotten to pricing equipment stage. It's a good question. What are you looking at per square foot? Because I don't see all that information necessarily, but you can get it from the peers that are ahead of you. Then the thing that you do, this is what I really tell people, you need a fixture plan. You got a store, you get a store designer to lay out a floor plan. And they're talking to you about what your vision is. And now you've got a list of equipment, produce cases, dairy cases, slicers, scales, everything. And now you can start pricing it. And the great news about the internet is you can actually price a lot of that sitting at home at the dining table. It used to not be so easy. With the refrigeration, if it's a small project, you're probably going to be working with a refrigeration contractor in your community, right? And you can go to Hussman online. You can be picking out cases. I'm not sure, but they might even be priced online. And then you might be working off of those prices. But you can build a lot of information. It's footwork, but you can keep improving on the accuracy of the assumptions that are going into at least parts of the pro forma. And as you do, you go back to your consultant and you say, I got new information. This is the basis of it. And then you can work together to agree on what the new assumptions are, update the pro forma, update it for the vision, and continually keep working on it until you get to something that looks where you're indicating a path that shows a good likelihood that the co-op can be financially successful with the significant investment it's going to take to get it open if it's able to operate according to the assumptions in the pro forma. So that's kind of the end. I just wanted to go over these parts. Usually when if I'm at up and coming and I'm talking about the pro forma, I'm talking about this is what it looks like, the first page, the second page. But I've never really, it was just a time to spend an hour with you and really talk about like, when do you get it? How do you select a consultant? A little bit about what goes into building it. I have fun building the spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. I got to tell you, this job is cool for me because on the one hand, I get to spend a lot of time with the structure of the pro forma, figuring out how to make it work to do its thing. And one of the things I love to do is build in like little switches that are built into the formulas. But the other thing I love about it is stuff like this, working with the clients, helping, I have a lifetime of working on this kind of stuff. And at 65, I can say that without embarrassment, because I actually have decades, and I can share that knowledge and that information. And that is a lot of fun for me.
Don, speaking
Really
of,
stop and just go back into sort of these little pieces like we did tonight. So that's where I'm going to bring it. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to let people, if there are questions, and even if people are like, if somebody wants to like look at a pro forma, I think I can do that.
Don, there is a question about spreadsheets from Joseph from Bay City Cooperative Market. Is there a blank pro forma spreadsheet with example headings and columns that we could work on and start putting together before going to a consultant?
So the answer is no. And I think that it would be a little bit of a, well, yes and no. In a pro forma, there's not really, but there is a worksheet that's available on FCI in their resources that's called the Sources and Uses Cash Flow Template. There's also a guide to using it. So it's not the, remember that the pro forma covers 2 time frames, from inception to opening, and then for 10 years. The cash flow, Sources and Uses Cash Flow Template covers that first time frame. It'll give you some of the rules of thumb, like start with $110 a foot for equipment. And you can go in and fill it in, and it will tell you it'll give you an idea. This is what you're looking at in terms of the cost of developing your co-op. And then you can go up to the sources and you can say, well, we're going to have this many members when we open, and our membership costs this much. And then you're going to, and it's going to be like, well, you're going to have to borrow or grants, and it's going to let you sort all that out. So the first half is available. FCI, Sources and Uses Cash Flow Template.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, I should have this. I'm going to, let's see here. Yes, okay. I'm going to put my email address. It's pretty straightforward in the chat. It's generally very easy to find me, but if you do have specific questions, I'd be happy to see what I can do to help.
Okay, we have a few.
Let's see here. Oh, go ahead.
A few coming in now.
Okay.
Also, Joseph says, thanks, that should help a lot. Jillian Jason also really recommends using FCI resources, sources and uses. The earlier, the better. Here. Jerry has a question. Do banks, lenders dissect a pro forma? Are they truly fluent in reading them?
So my expectation is the answer is yes, right? Banks are highly regulated, and they do not typically hand out cash without understanding the business that they are lending to. Particularly someone like National Cooperative Bank, NCB, they'll be very fluent in the pro forma. But one of the things that banks are going to be looking for too will be, because they don't just lend on a pro forma, they're also lending on the people, right? That's one of the things. So they're like, okay, what's your concept? And they want to know that like, this is the business. What's your business plan look like, right? If you're talking about hours of operation and how you're going to market it, you're starting to make them feel a little bit better about the risk profile involved with lending to the co-op. And then they want to be able to talk to you about your pro forma. What's the basis for it? What are your assumptions that are going into it? And they will often stress test the assumptions that are in the pro forma. But all of them are going to have someone who is able to do an analysis on the spreadsheet. At least that's my experience.
Another question from Sue Struthers about membership. How rigidly do we need to count members? If someone leaves the area or dies, do we need to take them off the list? I hear of a co-op asking each adult in a household to get their own membership. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess it depends on so in some ways, yes, and in some ways, it depends on what the use of the membership count, right? So if you look at the 4 and 3 model, and you'll see that there are recommended, they are not hard and fast, they're just recommended sort of levels to think about. So if you're thinking about, are we done with stage 1? Well, a good indicator is you have around 300 members. Remember that that's an indication of the amount of support you've built in the community. So if one person came in and bought 300 memberships and gave them to their friends, that's not as good a community support as if you've gotten 300 households to become members. If you've gotten 150 households to buy 2 memberships, that's good, but it's not as good as having 300 households. So part of it is not just to get a sheer number count. Part of it is like evaluating how well you've been able to tell your story in the community to get people engaged in the vision and the mission and excited about what you want to do. The other thing that's important about the membership base is that when you get to the campaign, the member capital campaign, because that's an important part of the sources of funds that you're going to raise, most co-ops, that only maybe 20% of your member base is going to actually be willing to invest additional funds in the co-op. So if you have 600 households, if both my wife and I are members, we're both members of the Durham co-op, but we're likely only going to make one investment. And so if you have 600 households, then you're looking at 120 potential investments in round numbers. If you have 600 individuals and 300 households, you're probably looking at 60 as an investment base. So, you know, I'm not concerned if someone leaves the area and they're still on the member rolls. I'm not concerned if 2 people from the same household buy memberships, but I do want co-ops to like honestly, openly evaluate how well have we done building support in the community. Are we ready to take the next step forward?
It's a great question. We have about 3 minutes left. Any questions, anything that's going to keep you up at night? We have a chance to ask Don now, so you can rest easily.
Also, one of the, let's see, Darnell's going to turn the recorder off here in just a couple of minutes, but I'll hang out. And if people want to just chat or talk in more detail, I'm happy to do that. And if everybody leaves, then I will be on my way as well. Let's see. Okay, so Darnell, why don't we do this? Why don't you go ahead and turn the recorder off and we'll close the meeting officially.